I woke up to the sound of my phone vibrating against the nightstand. It was still dark outside, and the clock on my phone read 3:12 a.m. Groggily, I reached for it, expecting a spam email or some late-night notification. Instead, it was a text from my buddy, Ryan. Bro, I'm sorry to be the one to tell you this, but I just saw Emily at 274 Parker Street. She was with someone. My heart stopped. Emily was my wife, my everything. We'd been married for 5 years, and as far as I knew, things were perfect. Sure, we had the occasional argument like any couple, but betrayal? No, she wasn't capable of that. Or so I thought. I stared at the message, rereading it until the words blurred. My first instinct was denial. Ryan must have been mistaken. Maybe it was someone who looked like her. But 274 Parker Street, that address tugged at a memory. It was a sketchy part of town, infamous for services. The kind no one talked about openly. I felt sick. My hands trembled as I typed back, "Are you sure?" The reply was instant. Positive.
I am sorry, Mom.
I thought you deserved to know. My mind raced. If Ryan was wrong, accusing Emily could destroy our relationship. But if he wasn't, couldn't let it slide. I needed proof. I didn't confront her. Not yet. Instead, I spent the next day pretending everything was normal. Emily went about her routine as if nothing had changed, smiling, laughing, kissing me goodbye before heading to work. It was like living with a stranger. That night, after she fell asleep, I snuck into the living room and started digging. I checked her phone, but it was locked. She'd recently changed her password. Suspicious. I went through our shared laptop, scouring her emails and social media. Nothing. Then I found it. An alternate email account she'd used to book appointments. Appointments at 274 Parker Street. My chest tightened. I wanted to scream, to wake her up and demand answers, but I stopped myself. Instead, I came up with a plan. The next day, I rented a dingy apartment on the edge of town, furnished it just enough to look convincing, and created a fake profile on one of those sites. I used a burner phone to send a message to the account I'd found. "Hi, interested in booking tonight. Are you available?" The reply came almost instantly. "Yes, 8 p.m. Address?" I gave her the address of the rented apartment and waited. My heart pounded as the minutes ticked by. At 7:55, there was a knock at the door. I opened it and there she was. Emily, my wife, dressed in a way I'd never seen before, looking both seductive and ashamed. Her eyes widened when she saw me. "Jason? What the hell?" I didn't say anything at first. I just stepped aside, letting her walk in. She hesitated but eventually entered, her heels clicking against the cheap tile floor. I closed the door behind her and leaned against it, arms crossed. "Explain," I said, my voice cold and steady. Emily stammered. I can't believe you did this. You've been spying on me? Setting me up? What is wrong with you?" I laughed bitterly. "What's wrong with me? You've been selling yourself, Emily, for money, behind my back. And you're asking what's wrong with me?" Her face turned red, a mix of anger and shame. "You don't understand. We've been struggling financially. I was just trying to help." "By prostituting yourself?" I spat. "Don't act like this was some noble sacrifice." She started crying, but I felt nothing. "Jason, please. I'm sorry. I was going to stop. I swear." "Were you? Or were you just hoping I'd never find out?" I reached into my pocket and pulled out the manila envelope I'd prepared. I tossed it on the table in front of her. "These are divorce papers. Sign them." Her tears stopped instantly. She stared at the envelope, then back at me. "You can't be serious. You're just going to throw everything away."
"No, Emily.
You did that the moment you decided our marriage wasn't enough for you." She didn't sign them that night. She begged and pleaded, tried to guilt me, tried to turn it around on me. But I stood firm. By the end of the week, the papers were signed, and I filed them. It wasn't until months later that I learned the full extent of her betrayal. Emily hadn't just been doing it for money. She'd been seeing someone regularly, a client she'd grown close to. Close enough that they'd started making plans to run away together. But here's the kicker. The client? It was Ryan, my friend who'd tipped me off in the first place. He'd orchestrated the whole thing, knowing it would blow up my marriage, leaving Emily free for him. When I confronted him, he didn't deny it. He just smirked and said, "You should thank me. At least now you know the truth." I didn't hit him. I wanted to, but I didn't. Instead, I walked away, leaving him and Emily to their twisted version of happiness. Last I heard, they'd moved in together. But karma has a funny way of catching up. Emily caught him cheating a few months later and threw him out. She tried reaching out to me, apologizing, begging for another chance, but I blocked her number. I'm better off now, free. And if there's one thing I've learned, it's this: betrayal doesn't just break you. It rebuilds you, stronger, smarter, and far less willing to put up with anyone's bullshit. Months turned into a year, and I'd built a life without Emily, without Ryan, and without the weight of their betrayal hanging over me. But just when I thought I'd closed that chapter for good, a new twist emerged. It started innocuously enough. I was at a coffee shop, sipping my latte and scrolling through my emails, when a familiar voice called out my name. "Jason." I turned, and there she was. Not Emily, but Claire, Ryan's ex-girlfriend. She looked different, sharper, like someone who'd been through her own share of hell and come out the other side. "Claire," I said, surprised. "Hey." She smiled faintly and gestured to the empty chair across from me. "Mind if I join you?" "Go ahead." We made small talk at first, catching up on the surface-level stuff. But soon, the conversation shifted to the elephant in the room. "Ryan, you know he's back in town, right?" she asked, stirring her coffee absent-mindedly. I stiffened. "No, I didn't. Why would I care?" Claire's eyes darkened. "Because he's been running his mouth, telling anyone who will listen that you set him up, that you're the one who drove Emily into his arms." I laughed bitterly. Of course he is. The guy's incapable of taking responsibility for his own actions. "It's worse than that," she said, leaning in. "He's got some scheme going. I don't know all the details, but he's dragging your name into it. Something about a business deal gone wrong." I frowned. Ryan was manipulative, sure, but a con artist? That was new territory. "Why are you telling me this?" Claire hesitated, her fingers tightening around her coffee cup. "Because he burned me, too. After you and Emily split, he made all these promises. Said we'd build a life together, but it was all lies. He drained my savings and left me with nothing." Her voice cracked, and for a moment, I saw the vulnerable woman beneath the tough exterior. "I'm not letting him get away with it. Not again." "What are you planning?" I asked cautiously. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "I've been digging. Ryan's been conning people left and right. Fake investments, fraudulent schemes, you name it. I've got a file on him that would make the FBI salivate." "And you want my help?" "You know him better than anyone," she said. "You've seen how he operates. If we work together, we can take him down." It was tempting. The idea of finally getting justice, of exposing Ryan for the snake he was, sent a thrill through me. But it was also risky. People like Ryan didn't go down without a fight. "I'll think about it," I said, though I'd already made up my mind. The next few weeks were a whirlwind. Claire and I met regularly, pooling our resources and piecing together the extent of Ryan's schemes. He'd scammed dozens of people, using his charm and false promises to siphon money from anyone gullible enough to trust him. We built a case so airtight it would make a lawyer weep with joy. Then we set the trap. It happened at a high-end networking event Ryan was hosting, under the guise of launching a new investment fund. Claire and I attended separately, blending into the crowd as we watched him work the room, spinning lies with ease. When the time was right, I approached him. "Ryan." He turned, and for a moment, his confident facade cracked. "Jason, what are you doing here?" "Oh, just enjoying the show," I said, my voice dripping with sarcasm. "Impressive turnout." Ryan narrowed his eyes. "What do you want?" "Justice." I said simply. At that moment, Claire stepped forward, a folder in hand. And we've got plenty of it right here. Ryan's face went pale as she opened the folder, revealing copies of the evidence we'd gathered. Bank statements, forged documents, testimonies from his victims. You're finished, Claire said, her voice cold and steady. Unless you want to make this easy and turn yourself in. He laughed nervously, but it was a hollow sound. You think this will stop me? You've got nothing. Oh, we've got plenty, I said. And so does the DA. As if on cue, two plainclothes detectives stepped forward, flashing their badges. Ryan Carter, you're under arrest for fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy. The room fell silent as Ryan was cuffed and led away. Claire and I exchanged a glance, a mixture of triumph and relief passing between us. In the weeks that followed, Ryan's empire crumbled. Victims came forward in droves, eager to share their stories. Emily was among them, though I avoided her. She was just another casualty of Ryan's greed, but I'd long since moved past her. As for Claire and me, we went our separate ways after Ryan's trial. There was no romance, no lingering connection. Just two people brought together by betrayal, united in their quest for justice, and now free to move on with their lives. And that was enough. After Ryan's arrest, life slowly began to return to normal, or as normal as it could get after the chaos of the past year. I went back to focusing on work, keeping my head down, and trying to rebuild the pieces of my life that had been shattered. But the scars of betrayal ran deep, and moving on wasn't as simple as I'd hoped. One evening, as I sat in my small, newly rented apartment, sipping on a beer and flipping through channels, my phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number. Jason, this is Amanda. Can we talk? Amanda was one of Ryan's former business associates. I hadn't seen or heard from her in years, not since Ryan's so-called network had collapsed. Curious, and admittedly a little wary, I replied, "What's this about?" The response came quickly. "It's about Ryan. I think there's something you should know. Can we meet?" I hesitated. Ryan was in jail, awaiting trial on a mountain of charges. What could Amanda possibly have to say that mattered now? Still, a part of me couldn't ignore the nagging curiosity. Fine. Tomorrow at 5. The coffee shop on Main. The next day, I arrived at the coffee shop early, grabbing a seat in the corner where I could see the door. Amanda walked in a few minutes later, looking nervous and out of place. She spotted me and made her way over, clutching a folder under her arm. "Jason," she said, sitting down across from me. "Thanks for meeting me." "Cut to the chase," I said. I wasn't in the mood for pleasantries. "What's this about?" Amanda glanced around, as if checking for eavesdroppers, then leaned in. "Ryan's not done. Even from jail, he's pulling strings. There's a lot more to his operation than you or I ever realized." I frowned. "What are you talking about?" "He's in custody. How could he possibly be running anything?" She opened the folder and slid a stack of papers across the table. "These are bank transfers, offshore accounts, shell companies. Ryan was smarter than we gave him credit for. The fraud we uncovered? That was just the tip of the iceberg." I flipped through the papers, my stomach sinking. Amanda was right. The documents outlined a web of financial transactions far more complex than anything Claire or I had unearthed. Ryan had been laundering money, hiding assets, and possibly even setting up new schemes from behind bars. "Why are you bringing this to me?" I asked, suspicion creeping into my voice. "Why not go to the police?" Amanda sighed. "Because I'm implicated in some of it." I didn't know the full extent of what Ryan was doing, but I was involved enough that if this comes out, I could go down with him. "So, what do you want from me?" "Help me expose him," she said. "Anonymously. If we get this information to the right people, we can stop him for good. But I need someone on the outside, someone with no ties to Ryan anymore, to make it happen." I leaned back in my chair, running a hand through my hair. Part of me wanted to walk away. I'd already spent enough time and energy dealing with Ryan's mess. But another part of me knew I couldn't ignore this. Not if it meant preventing more people from getting hurt. All right, I said finally. I'll help, but we do this my way. Over the next few weeks, Amanda and I worked in secret, compiling evidence and connecting the dots. It was exhausting and frustrating work, but slowly, a picture began to emerge. Ryan's reach was deeper than I'd ever imagined. He'd manipulated not just individuals but entire businesses, convincing them to invest in ventures that didn't exist. We handed everything over to a trusted contact of mine, a journalist with a reputation for uncovering high-profile scandals. When the story broke, it was like a bomb going off. The headlines splashed across every major news outlet, and Ryan's schemes were laid bare for the world to see. This time, there was no escaping justice. The new evidence ensured he'd face additional charges, and his chances of ever getting out of prison became non-existent. As for Amanda, she disappeared shortly after the story broke. I'd like to think she found a way to start over, to leave Ryan's shadow behind for good. As for me, I finally felt a sense of closure. The chapter was closed, the loose ends tied up, and for the first time in a long time I felt free. After the storm of media coverage faded and Ryan was securely locked away, I tried to reclaim what little normalcy remained in my life. Days turned into weeks, and I threw myself into work, long hours at the office, and late nights spent at the gym. It wasn't about fitness as much as it was about distraction. Anything to keep my mind off the chaos Ryan had left behind. But closure is a funny thing. Even when you think you've tied up every loose end, life has a way of reminding you that some knots were left undone. It was a Saturday morning when the knock came at my door. I wasn't expecting anyone, so I hesitated before opening it. Standing on the other side was a man I didn't recognize. Mid-40s, salt and pepper hair, a worn leather jacket that had seen better days. "Jason?" he asked, his voice low and gravelly. "Who's asking?" I replied, leaning against the doorframe. "Name's Mark. Mark Thompson." I knew Ryan. Hearing that name was like a punch to the gut. I fought the urge to slam the door in his face. Instead, I crossed my arms and stared him down. "What do you want?" Mark shifted uncomfortably, looking down at the ground before meeting my eyes again. "Look, I'm not here to cause trouble, but I think you need to know something. Ryan, he owed me money. A lot of money. And I'm not the only one. There are others." "That sounds like your problem," I said coldly. "Ryan's in prison. Whatever debts he left behind, I'm not part of them." "Maybe not," Mark said, stepping closer. "But you're the one who brought him down. Some of these people, they think you're involved, that you benefited from his scams." I felt a chill run down my spine. "That's ridiculous." "Yeah, well, people believe what they want to believe," Mark said. "I'm just giving you a heads up. There's talk. Some of it's getting dangerous." I stared at him, trying to gauge his sincerity. "Why tell me this? What's in it for you?" Mark sighed. "Ryan burned me too. Took everything I had. I'm just trying to make sure no one else gets hurt." For a moment, we stood there in silence, the weight of his words hanging between us. Finally, I nodded. "Thanks for the warning." Mark hesitated as if he wanted to say more, but then he just nodded and walked away. That night, I couldn't shake the unease. Ryan was gone, but his mess was still here, tangled up in the lives he'd ruined. And now, somehow, I was caught in the crossfire. The next morning, I decided to do some digging of my own. If people were talking, I needed to know who they were and what they wanted. I reached out to Claire, the only person who'd been in the trenches with me during Ryan's downfall. We met at a diner on the edge of town, the kind of place where no one asks questions. "You're telling me someone showed up at your door?" Claire asked, stirring her coffee. "And they think you were involved with Ryan's scams?" "That's what he said," I replied. "Mark Thompson. Ever heard of him?" Claire shook her head. "No, but it doesn't surprise me. Ryan screwed over a lot of people. There's bound to be fallout." "Yeah, well, now it's my problem," I said. "And I need to figure out how to fix it." Claire leaned back in her seat, studying me. "You think this guy was legit?" "I don't know," I admitted, "but I can't ignore it. If there's even a chance someone's coming after me." She nodded slowly. All right, let's start with the basics. I'll see what I can dig up on Mark Thompson. You focus on figuring out who else might have a grudge. Over the next few days, Claire and I worked tirelessly, piecing together the remnants of Ryan's network. What we found was disturbing. Mark was right, there were others. Investors, former associates, even employees who'd been left in financial ruin. And while most of them had moved on, a handful hadn't. They were angry, desperate, and looking for someone to blame. The more we uncovered, the clearer it became that Ryan's betrayal wasn't just a chapter of my past. It was a storm I was still caught in. And if I didn't act fast, it was going to destroy what little I had left. I couldn't shake the feeling that Mark's warning was more than just a heads-up. Something about the way he'd spoken, the way he'd looked over his shoulder as he left, told me there was more to the story. And I was right. It started a few nights later. I was walking back to my apartment after grabbing some groceries when I noticed a car idling a little too long at the curb near my building. The driver's face was obscured by the shadows, but the way the headlights flicked off as I approached sent a shiver down my spine. I took a detour, circling the block, watching as the car eventually pulled away. The next day, I got a call from Claire. "I found something on Mark Thompson," she said, her voice tight. "You're not going to like it." "Go on," I said, gripping the phone a little tighter. "He's not just some guy Ryan scammed. He's connected to a bigger network, the kind of people who don't just let debts slide." "Like organized crime?" I asked, the words tasting bitter as they left my mouth. "Maybe not full-on mob, but close enough. Ryan didn't just take Mark's money. He used it to fund some questionable ventures. And now that Ryan's out of the picture, they're looking for someone to settle the tab." I leaned against the wall, trying to process what she was saying. "And they think that someone is me?" "You're the most visible name left," Claire said. "You exposed Ryan. In their eyes, you're the guy who brought the whole thing down. That makes you a target." The air felt heavy, pressing against my chest. "What do I do?" "Lay low," she said, "and let me keep digging. If we can find proof that Ryan was the only one involved, we might be able to clear your name. And if we can't, then you need to watch your back." The days that followed were a blur of paranoia and half-measures. I started noticing things. A man loitering too long outside the coffee shop where I'd meet Claire. A black sedan parked near my office with the engine running. I changed my routines, started taking different routes home, but the feeling of being watched never left me. One evening, as I stepped out of the gym, I saw Mark waiting by my car. He didn't look angry or confrontational, just tired. "We need to talk," he said. "You've got 5 minutes," I replied, not bothering to hide my irritation. Mark nodded, stepping closer. "Look, I didn't tell you everything the other day. Ryan, he was involved in some bad stuff. He made promises to people he couldn't keep. When he couldn't pay up, he started naming names. Yours came up. Are you saying he framed me?" I asked, my voice rising. "Not exactly," Mark said. "But he made it sound like you were closer to his operation than you were. Said you were the one who had access to the money." I stared at him, disbelief and anger bubbling up inside me. "That's a lie." "I know that," Mark said quickly. "But the people he told? They don't care. They just want their money back." I rubbed my temples, feeling the weight of the situation pressing down on me. "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because they're getting impatient," Mark said. "And when they're impatient, people get hurt." I didn't trust him, not entirely, but I knew he wasn't lying about the danger. "What do you suggest?" Mark hesitated, then said, "There's a guy. He was close to Ryan, handled some of the logistics. If anyone has the proof you need to clear your name, it's him." "And where do I find this guy?" "That's the hard part," Mark said. "He's not exactly the kind of person you can just look up in the phone book. But I can get you a meeting, if you're willing to take the risk." I thought about it for a long moment, weighing my options. Finally, I nodded. "Set it up." Mark exhaled in relief. "All right, I'll be in touch." As I watched him walk away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was stepping into something far bigger than I'd anticipated. But I didn't have a choice. If I didn't fight to clear my name, no one else would. The meeting was set for the following Friday night, in the back room of a bar on the outskirts of the city. Mark had warned me to come alone, to keep my head down, and to say as little as possible. He'd also advised me to carry cash, a show of good faith for the kind of people we were dealing with. When Friday came, I parked my car a block away and walked to the bar. The place was a dive, with dim lighting, sticky floors, and a jukebox that croaked out old country songs. It wasn't the kind of place you'd find on Yelp, but it was perfect for off-the-record conversations. Mark was waiting for me near the entrance, nursing a whiskey and looking more jittery than usual. "You ready?" he asked when I walked in. "Not really," I replied, "but let's get this over with." He nodded and led me to a door near the back, rapping on it twice before it creaked open. A large man with a shaved head and arms the size of tree trunks stood in the doorway, looking me up and down. "This him?" the man asked Mark. "Yeah, he's clean," Mark said quickly. "Just here to talk." The man grunted and stepped aside, allowing us to enter. The room was small and smoky, with a single table in the center. Two men sat on one side of the table, their faces partially obscured by the haze. One of them gestured for me to sit. "Jason, right?" the man on the left said. He was older, with slicked back hair and a thin scar running down his cheek. "That's me," I said, sitting down across from them. My heart was pounding, but I kept my face neutral. "Mark says you're looking for some information," the man continued. "Something about clearing your name." "That's right," I said. "Ryan Carter dragged me into his mess, and now I'm paying the price for it. I need proof that I wasn't involved in his schemes." The man exchanged a glance with his companion, a younger guy with a shaved head and a leather jacket. "And why should we help you?" the older man asked, leaning forward. "What's in it for us?" I pulled out the envelope of cash I'd brought, sliding it across the table. "A token of appreciation," I said. "And if you've got what I need, I'll make it worth your while." The younger man grabbed the envelope, flipping through the bills before nodding to the older man. "All right," the older man said. "Here's the deal. Ryan owed a lot of people money, including us. He tried to sweet-talk his way out of it by throwing names around, making it sound like he had a whole crew backing him up. Your name came up more than once." "That's a lie," I said firmly. "I was never part of his operation." "We know," the younger man said. "That's why you're sitting here instead of, well, somewhere else." The older man pulled out a folder from under the table, sliding it toward me. "This is what we have on Ryan. Bank statements, emails, and a few, let's call them insurance policies. Your name's not in there, but it'll prove he was acting alone." I opened the folder, scanning the documents. They were exactly what I needed, detailed, incriminating, and completely exonerating me. "Thank you," I said, closing the folder. "This is more than I expected." "Don't thank us yet," the older man said, his voice hard. "We're doing this because it's good business. But if you ever cross us, or if any of this comes back to bite us—" "It won't," I said quickly. "You have my word." The man nodded, leaning back in his chair. "Good. Now get out of here." Mark and I left the bar in silence, walking back to my car. When we reached it, he finally spoke. "So what now?" "Now I make sure this ends," I said. "For good." After that meeting, I felt a strange mix of relief and tension. The folder in my hands was proof I'd been searching for, but it was also a reminder of how deep I was in. Mark's silence as we walked back to my car didn't help. He seemed to sense the weight of what had just happened. "You've got what you need now," Mark finally said as I unlocked the car door. "Use it wisely." "I will," I replied, but I could tell he wasn't convinced. The drive home felt longer than it was. Every shadow seemed to stretch further. Every set of headlights behind me stayed just a bit too long. Paranoia had become a constant companion, and tonight was no exception. When I got back to my apartment, I didn't waste time. I locked the door, pulled the blinds, and spread the contents of the folder out on the kitchen table. The documents were damning. Ryan's transactions, emails, and even a few handwritten notes painted a clear picture. He'd been working alone. My name appeared only in passing, mentioned as someone he'd considered roping into his schemes but never succeeded. It was everything I needed to clear my name, but the question was, how? I knew going to the authorities was the logical next step, but something about the meeting lingered in my mind. Those men didn't strike me as the type to leave loose ends. If I handed this over, would it come back to them? Would it come back to me? I sat there for hours, staring at the papers, trying to piece together a plan. By the time the sun started creeping through the blinds, I'd made up my mind. I'd start with someone I trusted, someone who could guide me without putting a target on my back. That someone was Claire. Later that morning, I called her. "I've got the proof," I said when she picked up. "Can you meet?" "You serious?" she asked, her voice laced with surprise. "You actually got something?" "Yeah, solid. But I need your help." "All right," she said. "Same diner as before? Noon. See you there." By the time I arrived, Claire was already seated, sipping a coffee and scanning the room. She always had a knack for reading people, and today was no different. "You look like you haven't slept," she said as I slid into the booth. "I haven't," I admitted, pulling the folder from my bag and setting it on the table. "Take a look." Claire opened the folder and began flipping through the documents. Her expression shifted from curiosity to shock to something I couldn't quite place. "This is wow," she said, leaning back. "This clears you completely. Ryan really was running a one-man show." "So, what's the move?" I asked. "Do we go to the cops?" Claire hesitated. "We have to be careful. Whoever gave you this, they're not going to appreciate their names getting dragged into an investigation." "I figured as much," I said. "But I can't sit on this. The longer I wait, the worse it gets." "There's another option," Claire said, her voice low. "We leak it, anonymously. Get it to a journalist who can connect the dots without implicating you or your sources." It wasn't a bad idea. Risky, but less so than walking into a police station with a folder full of evidence tied to dangerous people. "Do you know anyone?" I asked. Claire nodded. "I have a contact. She's good, trustworthy. If we give this to her, she'll make sure the story gets out without putting a spotlight on you." "All right," I said. "Let's do it." The next few days were a blur. Claire's contact, a seasoned journalist named Ellen, worked quickly. She verified the documents, cross-referenced the information, and within a week, the story broke. Headlines across major outlets exposed Ryan's schemes in full detail, clearing my name in the process. For the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe again. But even as the relief settled in, I knew this wasn't over. Ryan's mess had left scars on me, on the people he'd scammed, and on those who'd helped bring him down. And scars have a way of reminding you they're there, even long after the wound has healed. After the story broke, my phone wouldn't stop buzzing. Friends, acquaintances, and even a few strangers reached out, offering everything from congratulations to cautious warnings. Most of them meant well, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the attention was a double-edged sword. By the second day, I stopped answering calls altogether. I needed space to think, to figure out what came next. I wasn't naive enough to believe this was the end. The people Ryan had crossed weren't the forgiving type, and I just made myself visible to them all over again. That evening, Claire called. I hesitated before picking up, but something told me her call wasn't one I could ignore. "Jason," she said, her voice clipped. "We need to talk. In person." "What's going on?" I asked, already bracing for bad news. "Not over the phone. Can you come by my place?" "On my way," I said, grabbing my keys. When I arrived at Claire's apartment, she opened the door quickly, ushering me inside. Her usual calm demeanor was gone, replaced by a tension that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. "What's going on?" I repeated, more forcefully this time. "It's Ellen," Claire said, pacing the room. "She's been getting threats. Someone's not happy about the story." I felt my stomach drop. "What kind of threats?" "Phone calls, emails, Even a letter dropped off at her office, Claire said. They're not subtle, Jason. Whoever this is, they want her to shut up and stay out of it. And you think it's connected to Ryan? Claire stopped pacing and looked at me like I just asked the dumbest question in the world. Of course, it's connected to Ryan. You don't piss off people like that and walk away clean. I sank onto the couch, running a hand through my hair. What do we do? I've been thinking about that, Claire said, sitting across from me. We need to find out who's behind the threats. If we can identify them, we can shut this down before it escalates. You mean dig deeper? I asked, my voice tinged with disbelief. Haven't we done enough? You think this ends if we ignore it? Claire shot back. They're not going to stop, Jason. Not until they're sure this whole thing is buried. And maybe not even then. She was right, and we both knew it. I leaned forward, elbows on my knees, and nodded. All right, where do we start? Claire grabbed her laptop and opened a file she'd been compiling. Ellen forwarded me the emails and phone records. The letter. It's harder to trace, but I've got a friend who can take a look. For now, we focus on the digital trail. The next few days were a blur of late nights and mounting tension. Claire and I pored over every detail, cross-referencing names, IP addresses, and patterns that might point us in the right direction. It was tedious and frustrating, but eventually, a name emerged. Michael Russo. Russo wasn't just any name. He was one of Ryan's larger investors. Someone who'd poured a significant amount of money into Ryan's schemes and had lost big when the operation collapsed. According to what we found, Russo had a history of making problems disappear. This is our guy, Claire said, her eyes narrowing as she stared at Russo's photo on her screen. He's got the motive, the resources, and the reputation to back up those threats. So, what do we do with this? I asked, my voice tight with unease. We go to Ellen, Claire said. She needs to know who she's dealing with. And then, we find a way to make sure Russo knows we're not backing down. The thought of confronting someone like Russo made my skin crawl. But Claire was right. If we didn't face this head-on, it would only get worse. The next morning, we met Ellen at a quiet coffee shop, laying out everything we'd uncovered. She listened intently, her expression hardening as we detailed Russo's involvement. You're sure about this? She asked, her voice steady but laced with tension. As sure as we can be, Claire said. You need to be careful, Ellen. This guy doesn't play games. Ellen nodded, her jaw set. I'm not backing down, but I'll take precautions. As we left the coffee shop, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were walking a fine line. Russo wasn't the type to let things slide, and now we were firmly in his crosshairs. The question wasn't if he'd retaliate, it was when. The first sign of retaliation came 2 nights later. I was on my way back from a late shift at work when I noticed the headlights behind me. At first, I thought nothing of it, just another car on the road. But as I turned onto my street, the car followed. When I slowed down, it slowed down. And when I pulled into my driveway, it stopped a few houses down, idling. I stayed in my car, watching the rearview mirror. The engine hummed softly in the still night, a low, steady reminder that I wasn't alone. My mind raced, torn between stepping out and confronting whoever it was or playing it safe and staying inside. After a few tense minutes, the car drove off. But the message was clear. Someone was watching. The next morning, I called Claire and told her what happened. They're testing you, she said, trying to see if you'll crack. Well, it's working, I admitted, pacing my living room. What do we do? Claire's voice was steady, a stark contrast to my fraying nerves. We stick to the plan. Russo's trying to scare you. If you back off now, he wins. We can't let that happen. Her confidence gave me a shred of reassurance, but it wasn't enough to shake the unease that had settled in my chest. Still, she was right. Backing down wasn't an option. Ellen called later that afternoon. I've been getting more emails, she said. Whoever's behind this is escalating. They mentioned you by name this time, Jason. Great, I muttered, pinching the bridge of my nose. Anything useful? Not yet, Ellen replied. But I've got someone looking into it. In the meantime, watch your back. These people don't make idle threats. The tension only grew over the next few days. Russo's presence was felt in small, calculated ways. A car parked too close to my apartment. A note slipped under my door with nothing but a single word, "Stop." It was enough to keep me on edge but not enough to act on. Then came the break we needed. Claire called me late one night, her voice crackling with urgency. "Jason, we've got something." Ellen's contact traced one of the emails. "It leads back to an office Russo owns." "You're kidding," I said, sitting up in bed. "I wish I was. But this is it. Proof he's behind the threats. We can take this to the authorities." "And risk him finding out before they act?" I asked, my skepticism creeping in. "It's a risk we have to take," Claire said firmly. "If we sit on this, he'll only get bolder." Reluctantly, I agreed. The next morning, we handed everything over to a trusted detective Ellen knew. He promised to handle it quietly, assuring us that Russo wouldn't see it coming. For a few days, it felt like the tide was finally turning. The threatening cars disappeared, the emails stopped, and for the first time in weeks, I slept without looking over my shoulder. But the calm didn't last. One evening, as I was leaving work, I found my car keyed from front to back. The words "keep quiet" were scratched into the paint. It was a bold move, one meant to send a clear message. Russo wasn't done with me yet. I called Claire and Ellen immediately. "We need to escalate this," I said, my voice shaking with anger. "The detective isn't moving fast enough." "We'll push him," Ellen said. "But Jason, you need to stay calm. That's exactly what Russo wants, for you to act impulsively." Calm wasn't an option anymore. Russo had made this personal, and I wasn't going to let him win. If the authorities weren't going to stop him, I'd find another way. The following morning, I stared at the scratched-up side of my car, feeling equal parts anger and exhaustion. Russo's message was loud and clear, but the question was how far he was willing to go. I knew the longer this dragged on, the more dangerous it would become. Not just for me, but for Claire and Ellen too. Ellen's detective was moving too slow, tied up in bureaucracy and the need for airtight evidence. Meanwhile, Russo was escalating. I couldn't wait any longer. That afternoon, I met Claire at a small park away from prying eyes. She was sitting on a bench, her laptop bag slung over one shoulder, scanning the area like she was expecting trouble. "You're late," she said as I approached. "Got held up," I replied, sitting down next to her. "Any updates?" Claire nodded. "I've been digging into Russo's operations. He's not as invincible as he wants people to think. A lot of his businesses are fronts, shell companies, fake transactions. If we can expose that, it'll put him in a corner." "How do we expose it without making ourselves targets?" I asked. "That's the tricky part," Claire admitted. "We need someone who can leak the information without it tracing back to us. Someone with reach and credibility. Like Ellen." "No," Claire said firmly. "She's already in enough danger. We need someone outside this circle. Someone Russo wouldn't see coming." I thought for a moment before an idea clicked. "What about that journalist? The one who took down that real estate tycoon last year? Rachel Grant, wasn't it?" Claire's eyes lit up. "She'd be perfect. She's got a reputation for going after powerful people, and she's not afraid of blowback. Can you get in touch with her?" "I'll try," Claire said, already pulling out her phone. "But we need to move fast. Russo isn't going to give us much time." While Claire worked on reaching out to Rachel, I focused on my own preparations. I started keeping a low profile, varying my routines, and avoiding places where I might be cornered. Paranoia had become my new normal, but it was better than walking into another one of Russo's traps. 2 days later, Claire called with good news. "Rachel's interested. She's willing to meet, but she wants to see the evidence first." "Where and when?" I asked. "Tomorrow evening. A coffee shop downtown. I'll send you the details." The meeting with Rachel was tense but productive. She was sharp, asking pointed questions and scrutinizing every document we showed her. By the end, she leaned back in her chair, tapping a pen against her notebook. This is big, she said. If what you're saying checks out, Russo's going to have a lot more to worry about than just you. That's the idea, I said. But you know this isn't going to be easy, Rachel added. Russo's got friends in high places. He'll push back. Hard. We're ready for that, Claire said, though her voice betrayed a hint of uncertainty. Rachel nodded. All right, I'll start digging into this. But if I'm doing this, you two need to keep your heads down. The less noise you make, the better. The next few days were a waiting game. Rachel worked behind the scenes, piecing together a narrative that would expose Russo's empire for what it was. Meanwhile, Claire and I stayed on high alert, watching for any signs that Russo was onto us. Then, one night, I got a call from Rachel. Jason, it's happening, she said. The story goes live tomorrow morning. I exhaled, the weight of weeks of stress momentarily lifting. Thank you, Rachel. Really. Don't thank me yet, she replied. This is going to stir up a hornet's nest. You and Claire need to be ready for whatever comes next. The next morning, the headlines were everywhere. Russo empire built on lies. Michael Russo's fraudulent web exposed. And corruption at the core of Russo's business ventures. The story was airtight, backed by irrefutable evidence and testimonies from those Russo had wronged. For the first time in weeks, it felt like we had the upper hand. But deep down, I knew this wasn't the end. Russo wasn't the kind of man to go down quietly, and the storm we'd unleashed was only just beginning. The fallout from the article was immediate and explosive. Rachel Grant had done her job well, and Russo's name was suddenly everywhere, and not in the way he wanted. News outlets dissected every detail of his fraudulent empire, government agencies announced investigations, and even a few of his allies started distancing themselves to save their own reputations. But the victory felt fragile. 2 days after the story broke, Claire called me in a panic. Jason, I think we're being watched. What do you mean? I asked, my grip tightening on the phone. There's been a car parked outside my building for the past 3 hours. It's the same one I saw yesterday when I was running errands, she said, her voice trembling. I don't think it's a coincidence. All right, stay inside, I said. Lock your doors and windows. I'll be there in 20 minutes. I drove over to Claire's place, scanning the street as I approached. Sure enough, there was a black sedan parked a few doors down, its windows tinted. I pulled into her driveway, trying to act casual, but my heart was racing. Claire opened the door as soon as I knocked. Did you see it? She asked, her eyes wide. Yeah, I said, stepping inside. We need to figure out who's in that car and why they're here. And how do we do that? Claire asked, crossing her arms. We make them show their hand, I said, glancing out the window. Stay here. I'll handle this. Jason, no, Claire said, grabbing my arm. What if it's someone dangerous? It probably is, I admitted. But sitting here and doing nothing isn't an option. Before she could argue, I stepped outside and walked toward the sedan. My heart was pounding, but I kept my face neutral. The car's engine was off, and there was no movement inside. I knocked on the driver's side window, waiting. A few seconds later, the window rolled down, revealing a man in his late 40s with a square jaw and sunglasses. He didn't look surprised to see me. Can I help you? He asked, his tone flat. I was about to ask you the same thing, I said, crossing my arms. You've been sitting here for a while. Got a reason? The man smirked. Just doing my job. And what job is that? Keeping an eye on things, he said vaguely. You should mind your own business. This is my business, I shot back. And if you're here to intimidate us, it's not going to work. The man's smirk faded, and he leaned closer. Let me give you some advice. Stay out of things you don't understand. People like you end up getting hurt. I didn't flinch. Thanks for the warning. Now leave. The man didn't respond. He rolled up the window, started the car, and drove off. I stood there, watching until the sedan disappeared down the street. When I went back inside, Claire was pacing the living room. What happened? She asked. He's a hired thug, I said. Probably working for Russo. But he's just here to scare us. And what happens when scaring us isn't enough? Claire asked, her voice shaking. We don't let it get to that point, I said firmly. We stay ahead of him. If he thinks we're backing down, he'll push harder. But if we keep the pressure on, he'll make a mistake. Claire nodded, but the fear in her eyes was clear. I didn't blame her. I was afraid too. But fear wasn't going to stop Russo, and it wasn't going to protect us. The next day, I called Rachel and filled her in. Russo's people are watching us, I said. We need to move faster. I'm already working on it, Rachel said. But this isn't something we can rush. The more careful we are, the harder it'll be for him to retaliate. We don't have time to be careful, I said. Not when he's sending guys to sit outside our homes. Rachel was silent for a moment. All right, she said finally. I'll see what I can do. But Jason, you need to be smart about this. If you push too hard, Russo will push back harder. I hung up and leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling. The fight with Russo was far from over, and the stakes were only getting higher. But one thing was clear. Backing down wasn't an option. The next morning, the tension was palpable. Claire had spent the night at my place, too shaken to stay alone. I didn't blame her. The man in the car might have been all talk, but Russo's reputation suggested otherwise. This was a man who didn't tolerate loose ends. Over coffee, Claire and I mapped out our next steps. We need to make the next move before Russo does, she said, her voice steadier than I expected. Rachel's working on it, I reminded her. She'll get something solid. Claire shook her head. That's not enough. Russo's people already know we're involved. Waiting for Rachel to finish her investigation is just giving them more time to close in. She was right, and I hated it. We were playing defense, reacting to Russo's moves instead of forcing him to react to ours. So what do you suggest? I asked. Claire hesitated, then pulled a folded piece of paper from her pocket. This is an address I found while digging into Russo's shell companies. It's one of his lesser-known properties, listed under a fake name. I think it's where he keeps sensitive files, the kind of evidence we need to bring him down. I stared at the address. And you think we should, what? Break in? I think we need to take a risk, Claire said. If we can get our hands on those files, we'll have leverage. Enough to make Russo back off. It was insane, reckless. But it was also the only proactive move we had. After a long silence, I nodded. All right, let's do it. That evening, Claire and I drove to the address she'd found. It was a nondescript office building on the outskirts of the city, the kind of place you wouldn't look at twice. We parked a block away and approached on foot, keeping to the shadows. You sure about this? I whispered as we reached the building. Not even a little, Claire admitted. But we don't have a choice. The building was locked, but Claire had come prepared. She pulled out a small toolkit and started working on the door. I kept watch, every nerve in my body on edge. After what felt like an eternity, the lock clicked open. We're in, Claire said, pushing the door open. Inside, the place was eerily quiet. We moved quickly, checking rooms and searching for anything that looked important. Finally, we found an office with a locked filing cabinet. Claire worked on the lock while I rifled through the desk, finding a laptop that looked promising. Got it? Claire whispered, pulling a folder from the cabinet. Inside were documents, bank statements, contracts, and what looked like ledgers. This is it. I stuffed the laptop into my bag while Claire took photos of the documents. We were almost done when we heard footsteps outside the office. Someone's here, I hissed. Claire's eyes widened. We need to go. Now. We grabbed what we could and slipped out of the office, moving as quietly as possible. The footsteps were getting closer, and my heart felt like it was about to explode. Just as we reached the exit, a voice called out behind us. Hey! Stop! We bolted. Claire and I ran down the alley behind the building, ducking into side streets and weaving through backyards until we were sure we weren't being followed. By the time we reached the car, we were both out of breath. That was too close, Claire said, clutching the folder to her chest. But we got what we needed. I said, starting the car. Now we make sure it was worth it. Back at my apartment, we went through everything we'd taken. The documents and the laptop were a goldmine. They detailed Russo's operations in full, from his money laundering schemes to the names of his accomplices. This was the kind of evidence that could take him down for good. But it also made us targets. If Russo found out what we'd done, he wouldn't hesitate to retaliate. We need to get this to Rachel, Claire said. The sooner this goes public, the safer we'll be. I nodded, but a part of me couldn't shake the feeling that we just lit a match in a room full of gasoline. Russo wasn't going to go down without a fight, and now we were in deeper than ever. The morning after our break-in, the weight of what we had done started to sink in. Russo would know soon enough that someone had accessed his files. If he hadn't already guessed, it wouldn't take him long to figure out who was behind it. Claire sat at my kitchen table, scrolling through the documents again on her laptop. "We need to send this to Rachel now," she said, her tone urgent. "Every minute we sit on this is a minute Russo has to get ahead of us." I leaned against the counter, sipping my coffee, trying to steady my nerves. And what if he retaliates before the story goes live? He's not going to just wait for this to blow over. "That's why we have to act fast," Claire insisted. "The sooner this is out there, the harder it'll be for him to silence us." She was right, but it didn't make the decision any easier. Publishing the information meant going all in. There would be no turning back. After a long pause, I nodded. "All right, let's get this to Rachel." Rachel met us in the parking lot of a busy shopping center, a neutral location that made it harder for anyone to track us. She arrived with a satchel slung over her shoulder, her usual calm demeanor replaced by a palpable sense of urgency. "Let's see what you've got," she said as we handed over a flash drive and the folder of documents. Claire and I sat in her car as Rachel plugged the drive into her laptop, her eyes scanning the screen with laser focus. "This is huge," she said after a few minutes. "If half of this checks out, Russo's done." "It all checks out," Claire said confidently. "We've double-checked everything." Rachel nodded, her fingers flying over the keyboard as she copied the files. "I'll need to verify some of this with my sources, but if everything's solid, I can have a draft ready by tomorrow morning." "Tomorrow?" I asked, a knot tightening in my stomach. "Can't you move faster?" "This isn't the kind of thing you rush," Rachel said firmly. "If we're going to take Russo down, we need to make sure every piece of this is airtight." I didn't like it, but I understood. Russo would come after us either way, but a half-baked story wouldn't stop him. A bulletproof exposé might. That night, Claire stayed at my apartment again. Neither of us could sleep, the tension in the air thick enough to cut. Around 2 a.m., we heard the sound of a car idling outside. I peered through the blinds, my heart pounding. The same black sedan from before was parked across the street. Its headlights were off, but the faint glow of a cigarette was visible in the driver's seat. "He's here," I said, stepping away from the window. Claire's face paled. "What do we do?" I grabbed my phone and dialed Rachel. She answered groggily but snapped to attention when I explained what was happening. "Stay inside," she said. "I'll call someone I trust to drive by and check it out." Minutes later, another car pulled onto the street, its headlights sweeping over the sedan. The cigarette's glow disappeared, and the sedan's engine roared to life. It sped off, disappearing into the night. "Who did you call?" I asked when Rachel called back to confirm the sedan had left. "A friend in law enforcement," she said. "They're not officially involved, but they're willing to keep an eye on things." It wasn't much, but it was something. For now, at least, we were safe. The next morning, Rachel sent us a draft of her story. It was meticulous, detailed, and devastating for Russo. She had corroborated the documents we provided with additional sources, painting a damning picture of his operations. "This will blow the lid off his empire," Rachel said when we met later that day to review the piece. "But you two need to be ready. Once this goes live, things are going to escalate." "What do you mean by escalate?" Claire asked, her voice tight. "Russo's going to fight back," Rachel said. "Not just legally. People like him don't go down quietly. We're ready, I said, though I wasn't sure I believed it. Rachel nodded. Good. The story goes live at 8 a.m. tomorrow. Make sure you're somewhere safe. The morning of the article's publication, Claire and I packed bags and left my apartment, heading to a hotel under an alias. Rachel's expose hit the newsstands and online platforms like a bomb. Social media lit up with hashtags calling for Russo's arrest, and news anchors dissected the story in real time. By noon, Russo's office had released a statement denying everything, but the damage was done. Investigators announced they were reopening cases against him, and even some of his closest allies began to distance themselves. But the victory was short-lived. By evening, I received a text from an unknown number. You think you've won? This isn't over. I showed the message to Claire, her face going pale. What now? She whispered. We keep going, I said, my voice steady despite the knot in my stomach. If Russo wants a fight, we'll give him one. The final chapter began with a phone call. It was Rachel. Her voice was steady but urgent. Jason, we need to meet. Now, something big just broke. I glanced at Claire, who was sitting across the hotel room with her laptop. Where? Public place. The park near downtown. 30 minutes, Rachel said before hanging up. Claire and I exchanged a look. There was no need for words. We grabbed our things and left. The park was bustling with families and joggers, an odd contrast to the storm brewing around us. Rachel was already there, sitting on a bench with a manila folder in her lap. She gestured for us to join her. What is it? I asked, sitting down beside her. Rachel handed me the folder. It's Russo's next move. He's trying to shift the narrative, claiming he's the victim of a smear campaign. He's pulled in some favors with certain media outlets. If this gains traction, it could undermine everything we've worked for. Claire leaned over to look at the documents. How credible is this? Not very, Rachel admitted. But Russo doesn't need it to be credible. He just needs to plant doubt. Enough to muddy the waters and make people hesitate. I clenched my fists. So what do we do? Rachel's gaze was sharp. We go on the offensive. I have one more piece of the story, something I've been holding back. If we release it now, it'll destroy any chance Russo has of spinning this. What is it? Claire asked. Rachel hesitated, then said, a whistleblower. Someone who used to work directly with Russo. They have proof of his involvement in not just financial crimes but, worse, human trafficking, illegal arms deals. It's explosive, but it also puts them at enormous risk. My stomach turned. And they're willing to come forward? Yes, Rachel said, but only if they have our guarantee that we'll protect them. Claire looked at me, her expression unreadable. Can we do that? Can we keep them safe? I thought about it. About the risks, the danger, the lives already caught in the crossfire. And then I nodded. We don't have a choice. We do it. The whistleblower's testimony went live the next morning, accompanied by hard evidence that tied Russo to a web of criminal activity far beyond what anyone had suspected. It was the kind of story that couldn't be ignored, no matter how hard Russo tried to bury it. The fallout was immediate. Federal agents raided Russo's properties, seizing documents, computers, and hard drives. His closest allies began to turn on him, scrambling to save themselves. By the end of the day, an arrest warrant had been issued, and Russo was officially on the run. But the victory felt hollow. Even as the world celebrated Russo's downfall, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. Men like Russo didn't go quietly, and the text message I received that night confirmed it. You think this ends with me? It doesn't. I showed the message to Claire, who'd been monitoring the news updates. He's bluffing, she said, though her voice lacked conviction. Maybe, I said, but we can't take that chance. The weeks that followed were a blur of interviews, investigations, and sleepless nights. Russo's empire crumbled, his assets frozen, his reputation obliterated. But true to his word, the chaos didn't end with him. Some of Russo's associates tried to fill the void he left behind, reigniting old grudges and targeting those they blamed for his downfall. Claire and I went into hiding, moving from place to place, always looking over our shoulders. It wasn't until months later, when Russo was finally captured trying to flee the country, that the pressure began to ease. The trials that followed were grueling, but they brought closure. Russo was sentenced to life without parole, and his network was dismantled piece by piece. By then, Claire and I were living in a new city under new identities. The scars of what we'd been through would never fully heal, but we'd found a way to move forward. One evening, as we sat on the balcony of our small apartment, watching the sun set over the skyline,